My parents ridiculed my business savvy, blatantly belittled my job. Then the board chair dropped a bombshell. She owns 60% of the company now as the room froze in stunned shock. That day, the sound of my dad's patronizing laugh echoed through the mahogany-paneled boardroom. It was that same, condescending chuckle I'd heard my entire life, the one that meant, "Oh, you adorable child, leave the serious stuff to the adults." But this time, it was different. This time, I was ready. For 5 years, I'd been quietly, meticulously building my own investment portfolio. 5 years of watching my parents, Robert and Evelyn Mercer, disregard every single suggestion I offered about their struggling tech manufacturing business. Every family dinner, it was the same old refrain, "Let the adults handle things, dear." They had no idea. 30 years ago, my parents founded Mercer Technologies out of their garage. They specialized in aircraft circuit boards, and for 2 decades, they owned that niche. But the last 7 years? They'd been brutal. Foreign competition, a complete lack of innovation, and, honestly, some truly terrible financial decisions had them bleeding money. My parents thought I'd majored in some pointless subject at MIT, computational finance and applied mathematics. They thought I'd taken a little job at a Boston boutique investing firm after graduation. They had no clue that I was more than just an analyst. I had a partner. And together, over those 5 years, I'd transformed my signing bonus and early stock options into a significant, truly substantial personal portfolio. Mercer Technologies was collapsing. That's what brought us to this emergency board meeting. They were 10 weeks from bankruptcy, having burned through credit lines and infuriated 2 major clients with delayed deliveries. I'd intentionally arrived late, slipping into a seat at the back of the room, even though the board had been meeting for 3 hours already. Mom saw me immediately. "Claire, what are you doing here? This is a board meeting." I kept my voice soft level. I was invited. That's when Dad laughed. That laugh. "Invited? Honey, this is serious business. We're talking about the company's future." "I'm aware of that," I said, a slight edge in my tone. "Are you?" "Because we're discussing complicated financial restructuring, debt-to-equity swaps, and convertible notes." Mom's voice was sharp. "You can't just Google this, Claire." I just quietly opened my laptop. The board members shifted uneasily. Most of them knew exactly why I was there. My parents, however, were completely oblivious that the chairman had insisted on my attendance. Their CFO, Andrew Collins, tried to smooth things over. "Maybe we should carry on with the agenda, Robert and Evelyn. The refinancing proposals need discussing." Dad, still staring at me, waved him off. "In a minute. Claire, I know you're trying to be encouraging, but this isn't really suitable. These conversations about the company's financial state are private." "I'm aware of the financial situation," I said gently. Over a 5-year period, revenue decreased by 38%. $22 million in operating losses in just the most recent quarter. You might have 10 weeks of runway at the current burn rate. The room went silent. Mom blushed. "You heard those statistics, but where?" "The initial financial statements," I replied. "I went over them last week. These reports are private." Dad was losing his temper. "Who gave these to you?" Charles Whitmore, one of the original angel investors and the board chairman, cleared his throat. "Evelyn, Robert, I believe we must. No, this is totally unsuitable." Mom cut him off, looking at me. "I'm not sure what you're doing, Claire, but you have to go right now." I stayed put. I have the ability to vote on this board. I am perfectly entitled to be here. Dad laughed again, that same patronizing sound I'd heard my entire life when I tried to talk business with them. "A voting participant? Claire, you have no stock in Mercer Technologies. You're not on the board." "I'm not sure who told you that you could just walk into a board meeting." Charles whispered, "She owns half of the business." The words hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Mom slowly turned to Charles. "What did you just say?" "Claire controls 50% of Mercer Technologies," he stated calmly. "For the last 18 months, she has been accumulating shares. She has been our biggest stakeholder for the past 6 months." I watched my father's expression shift from bewilderment to astonishment, then to pure rage. "That is not feasible. The shares are held in close proximity. Any transfer would require our approval. Charles explained that the shares I bought came from 3 board members who sold their positions, as well as the employee stock option pool. Every lawful, arm's-length transaction, duly recorded with the SEC. This is absurd. Mom exclaimed, though the assurance in her voice had vanished. That's not the kind of money Claire has. Are you aware of the value of 50% of this business? It's about $500 million based on your most recent valuation, I said. In all honesty, though, that valuation was high. I'd place the genuine worth closer to $380 million based on current performance, meaning I overpaid by roughly $120 million. The ensuing hush was deafening. Andrew's fingers were flying across his laptop keys. He's right, he murmured. By God, all the filings are here. How could I have missed this? I clarified that the acquisitions were done through 3 separate LLCs. They're all appropriately stated, but it would take some research to link them all to me. With a loud scrape of his chair, Dad got to his feet. What game are you playing, Claire? This seems like a joke. He turned to the board members, almost pleading for them to agree. No game, Dad, I said, my voice firm. I'm an investor, and frankly, I'm a concerned one. This company is in serious trouble. He gestured at me, his voice growing louder, no longer polished. She can't even read a balance sheet. She's 28. She's employed as a junior analyst of some sort. Charles cut him off. She's a managing partner at Quantum Capital. For the past 2 years, she has managed their tech portfolio. Last year, her fund made a 38% return. Mom had turned pale. That's not possible. We would have known. You would have told us. Why? I asked, my voice rising slightly. So you could write it off the same way you've written off everything else I've ever done? Tell me how the real world is beyond my comprehension? Tell me my small job isn't a legitimate business. Don't take that tone with us. Mom yelled, but there was a hint of desperation in her voice. Now then, don't dismiss me in a board meeting, I said, maintaining my composure. I nodded to a board member who looked visibly uneasy. I'm here as an investor, a majority. Investor, actually. Since I closed a purchase agreement this morning for an additional 8% from Daniel Langford, I'm now at 60%. Majority stakeholder. The room erupted. 3 board members began talking at once. Andrew was typing frantically. My parents simply stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. Charles pounded his gavel. Order. Please, let's everybody calm down and address this rationally. There's nothing rational about this. Dad retorted, his voice harsher but quieter now. If this is true, and I'm not saying I believe it yet, but if it's true, then what? What exactly do you think you're going to do, Claire? Swoop in and save the company with your vast business experience. I'm going to vote to approve the restructuring plan Charles proposed, I replied. Mom turned to Charles, aghast. The one you were about to reject? What restructuring plan? Charles passed a document across the table. Quantum Capital, through one of its funds, has offered a $250 million investment. It would give Mercer Technologies the capital to retool the manufacturing line, invest in the R&D you've been cutting, and hire the senior management you desperately need. In exchange, they take a convertible note that would allow them to increase their equity position to 65% if certain performance milestones aren't met. Absolutely not. Dad replied immediately. We're not diluting ourselves into minority shareholders of our own company. You already are minority shareholders, I replied flatly. This is corporate rating, Mom declared, her voice trembling with rage. I own 60% as of this morning. You're trying to steal the company we built. I'm trying to save it, I shot back. If you file for bankruptcy, you'll lose everything. The company will be liquidated. The brand will be sold for parts, and the 300 employees will lose their jobs. This way, the company survives, grows, and everybody keeps their jobs. Under your control? Dad asked angrily. Under professional management, I clarified. I'm voting to retain Charles as chairman. I'm voting to bring in Caroline Hayes from Innovate as CEO, and I'm voting to create a new executive committee that will actually hold leadership accountable to the board. And what about us? Mom whispered, her shoulders slumping. I looked her directly in the eye. You'll remain on the board. You'll keep your salaries, Reduce to market rate, and you'll have the satisfaction of watching the company you built continue to exist, instead of being dismantled in bankruptcy court. This is insane, Dad said, pacing now, running his hands through his hair. You're 28 years old. You've been working for what, 7 years, and you expect us to believe you have $500 million to invest in a struggling manufacturing company. I had $700 million under management as of last quarter. Personally, I stated, my voice calm despite the storm. That doesn't count the $4.5 billion in the funds I manage for Quantum. The Mercer Technologies investment represents about 70% of my personal portfolio. It's a significant bet, yes, but I've run the models. With proper management and the right capital investment, this company can be worth $2.5 billion in 5 years. Andrew was slowly nodding. The models are actually conservative if we can lock down the SpaceX contract she's referring to in her analysis. Mom interrupted. What SpaceX contract? The one I've been negotiating for the last 5 months, I said. They need a specialized circuit board manufacturer for their next-generation Starlink satellites. Mercer Technologies has the perfect capabilities, but you don't have the capital to handle the order volume. With Quantum's investment, you'd be able to expand production enough to handle it. It's a $400 million contract over 4 years with options for renewal. Once more, total silence fell over the room. Dad was no longer pacing. Mom was clutching the edge of the table. At last, Mom spoke, her voice small. Why? If you have all this money, all this success, why invest in us? You could have let us fail. You could have bought the assets in bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar. Because despite everything, it's still the company you built, I replied quietly. Because 300 people depend on these jobs. Because the technology is actually good, the brand has value, and the market opportunity is real. And because I wanted to prove that I could do it. Prove what? Dad asked. That I understand business, I uttered. The words lingered in the air. I saw my mother avert her gaze and my father's cheeks flush. Charles cleared his throat. I think we should take a 2-minute recess. Let everybody process this information. Then we can reconvene and vote on the restructuring proposal. Most of the board members avoided making eye contact with my parents as they filed out. Andrew left his laptop open, the SEC filings still visible on the screen. Charles hesitated at the door, and I nodded, joining him in the corridor, leaving my parents alone in the boardroom. Claire, he said once we were out of earshot, that was brutal. It was necessary, I answered. You could have told them privately. I tried, I countered, shaking my head. For months ago, I called Dad and told him I wanted to discuss the company's financial situation. He told me I should focus on my career and let him worry about the business. They weren't going to listen unless they had no choice. Charles gave a slow nod. The restructuring plan is solid. Caroline Hayes is an excellent choice for CEO. But you know this is going to destroy your relationship with your parents. What relationship? I questioned. The one where they dismiss everything I say? Where every achievement is diminished because it doesn't match their definition of success. Where I'm still treated like a child who doesn't understand how the world works. They're proud of what they built, Charles remarked. This company has been their entire life. I know, I said. And I'm trying to make sure it survives. But they have to understand that their way isn't working anymore. The market has changed. The technology has changed. They needed to evolve and they refused. And now you're forcing their hand, Charles concluded. Yes. He examined me thoroughly. You know, he continued, when you first approached me about buying my shares, I almost said no. I thought you were too young, too inexperienced. But then I looked at your track record, looked at the companies you'd invested in, the returns you generated. You have an instinct for this that most people spend decades developing. My parents taught me everything about manufacturing, I replied. They just didn't realize they were also teaching me how to spot inefficiencies, how to analyze markets, how to evaluate risk. I just applied those lessons to finance instead of circuit boards. Ironic, isn't it? Extremely. For a few moments, we stood silently, watching my parents through the boardroom windows. They sat at opposite ends of the long table, not exchanging words. They're going to fight this, Charles said. They're going to look for any legal angle to block the restructuring. I know, I admitted. That's why I made sure every filing was perfect, every transaction was arm's length, every disclosure was timely. They won't discover anything wrong, even if they hire the world's top attorneys. This is something you've been preparing for a while. 18 months, I verified. I've been aware of how dire things had become ever since I first viewed the quarterly financials. Charles shook his head slowly. Your parents are brilliant engineers. They built revolutionary technology, but they're terrible managers, and they're even worse at admitting when they need help. That's why the restructuring plan puts real operators in charge, I explained. People who know how to scale a manufacturing business, how to manage supply chains, how to handle growth. My parents can focus on what they're actually good at, engineering and product development, just not running the day-to-day operations. Think they'll accept that? They don't have a choice, I stated. I control 60% of the shares. I can outvote them on any decision. That's not what I asked. I exhaled. No, probably not. At least not at first. But eventually, when the company stabilizes and starts growing again, maybe they'll understand. And if they don't, then at least 300 people keep their jobs, and a good company doesn't die because of ego and stubbornness. 20 minutes turned into 25, then 30. Charles finally suggested we get back together. The board members filed in, returning to their seats. The last people inside were my parents, who sat together at one end, putting up a unified front. Charles called the meeting to order. We have a proposal on the table for a $250 million investment from Quantum Capital in exchange for convertible notes and board restructuring. I'd like to open the floor for discussion before we vote. I have something to say, Dad said, getting to his feet. He had regained some of his control, and his voice took on that official tone he used when giving a speech he thought was significant. What Claire has done here today is legal, perhaps, but it's not ethical. She's used her position, her knowledge of our vulnerabilities, to orchestrate a hostile takeover of the company her mother and I spent 30 years building. Claire, I started, but he held up a hand. I'm not finished. You sat in our home, ate at our table, and said nothing while you were secretly buying up shares in our company. You positioned yourself to swoop in when we were most vulnerable and seized control. And now you want us to simply accept that we're minority shareholders in our own company? That we should step aside and let some outsider take over. Caroline Hayes isn't an outsider, I said. She's one of the most respected operators in the industry. She took Innovate from $60 million in revenue to $950 million in 9 years. She's not us, Mom remarked. She doesn't understand our culture, our values, what we've built here. With respect, Andrew interjected quietly. Our culture and values won't matter if the company goes bankrupt in 3 months. Mom turned on Andrew. Whose side are you on, Andrew? I'm on the side of the 300 employees who depend on their paychecks, Andrew firmly stated. I'm on the side of the pension fund that covers their retirement. I'm on the side of keeping this company alive, and Claire's plan is the only viable option on the table. That's not true, Dad countered. We have other offers You have one other offer, Charles said, cutting him off. From Davidson Industrial. They're offering $150 million for the assets in bankruptcy. They'll keep maybe 50 employees to handle the transition, then shut down the facility and move production to their plant in Malaysia. Everyone else loses their job. There have to be other options. Mom urged. There aren't, I said, my voice heavy. I've spent 5 months looking. I've talked to every strategic buyer, every private equity firm, every investment bank that might have an interest. The market for specialized circuit board manufacturers is brutal right now. You're competing against companies with lower costs, better technology, and deeper pockets. The only reason Quantum is willing to invest is because I'm willing to bet my personal capital on the turnaround, and because I've already secured the SpaceX contract contingent on this restructuring. You should have come to us, Dad replied, and his voice cracked a little for the first time. You should have told us what you were planning. I tried to tell you 4 months ago that the company was in trouble, I reminded him. You told me I didn't understand business. That was different. How? I inquired, fixing him with a stare. How was it different? I tried to offer advice, tried to point out the problems I was seeing, and you dismissed me. Just like you've dismissed me my entire life whenever I tried to talk about business or finance or strategy. That's not fair, Mom remarked. Isn't it? I asked, giving her a direct look. How many times have you told me my degree was impractical? How many times have you called my job cute or sweet? How many dinners have you told me to leave the business talk to people who understand it? The stillness that followed was heavy with years of repressed hurt. I didn't want it to be like this, I finally replied. I wanted to help. I wanted to use what I've learned, what I've built, to save the company you created. But you couldn't see me as anything other than your daughter who doesn't understand the real world. You're 28 years old, Dad responded, but the conviction in his voice had faded. I'm 28 years old with $700 million under management and a track record of successful investments in 20 different companies, I responded. I'm 28 years old who saw the SpaceX opportunity you missed. I'm 28 years old who put together a restructuring plan that will save 300 jobs. At what point do I stop being too young and start being someone you listen to? Nobody knew how to respond to that. Charles cleared his throat. I think we should vote. All in favor of accepting the quantum capital restructuring proposal. Without delay, I held up my hand. Charles lifted his. Andrew and 3 other board members raised theirs. 6 out of 11. My parents held out their hands, joined by 2 additional board members who were former coworkers. For votes against. The motion carries, declared Charles. The restructuring is approved. Dad suddenly got to his feet. We'll challenge this. We'll find a lawyer who can prove that Claire manipulated the situation, used insider information. Every trade was logged and disclosed, Andrew muttered. I've reviewed every transaction. They're all clean. Robert, you can employ any attorney in New York. Nothing will change as a result. I couldn't quite interpret Mom's expression as she stared at me. Anger, hurt, or something else. There's one more item on the agenda, Charles stated. Claire has requested to address the full company staff tomorrow at 10 a.m. She wants to explain the restructuring and answer questions. I think that's appropriate given her position as majority shareholder. Absolutely not, Dad replied. Those are our employees. They're the company's employees, I gently corrected, and they deserve to hear what's happening from someone who can actually answer their questions about job security and the future. What you've done here today, Claire, Mom muttered as she got up and gathered her belongings. This is wrong, she continued. It goes beyond business. Your family has been ruined by your control and money. I've saved your company, I responded. Whether you can see that or not. The other board members filed out more slowly, some pausing to shake my hand or whisper, congratulations. My parents departed without saying anything more. At last, it was just Charles, Andrew, and me in the boardroom. Well, Andrew replied, that was the most dramatic board meeting I've attended in 40 years of corporate finance. It had to be done, Charles replied. Robert and Evelyn would have driven this company into the ground rather than admit they needed help. Are they going to get over this as people? I mean, not as executives, Andrew inquired. I don't know, I said after giving that subject some attention. Perhaps in the future, or perhaps they will never be able to forgive me for disproving them. For what it's worth, Charles remarked. You made the correct decision. It's the right thing, not the easy thing. I should get ready for tomorrow's meeting, I said as I closed my laptop and gathered my documents. There will be a lot of questions from the staff. Claire, Andrew asked as I got to the door, is that SpaceX deal truly solid? Verbal commitment from their VP of supply chain, I said with a small smile. Their legal team is finalizing the terms of the contract. Signatures ought to be received in 4 weeks. Why? Because if you do that, he continued, this business not only survives but flourishes. You'll have turned it from a struggling manufacturer into a vital supplier to the world's largest space corporation. That's the plan, I said. I learned to think large from my parents. They simply didn't anticipate that I would think more expansively than they did. As the sun began to set over the parking lot, I left the building to find my phone buzzing with messages. Caroline Hayes wanted to talk about transition planning. My lawyer wanted to make sure the restructuring documents were filed correctly. My quantum capital team wanted updates. And my parents? They hadn't responded. For a long time, I sat in my car and gazed at the Mercer Technologies building. 30 years of my parents' labor. 30 years of innovation, difficulty, triumph, and finally, 30 years of a failure to adapt. And now it was my responsibility to make it right. My phone buzzed once more. It was Charles. Employee meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. conference room B. There will be about 300 persons present. The majority are afraid. Prepare yourself for challenging inquiries. I typed my response, I'm ready. And I was. I'd spent 18 months preparing for this moment. 5 months negotiating the SpaceX contract, countless hours examining every part of the business. I understood the company better than my parents did now. Every manufacturing line, every efficiency ratio, every cost center. But I was unprepared for the hollow feeling in my chest when I thought about my mother's face as she had left the boardroom, in the way my father's voice had cracked when he had asked why I hadn't come to them. Even though I had tried to do so 4 months, 7 months, and a year ago, but each time had been met with condescension, dismissal, and the same worn-out refrain that I didn't understand business. Now that they were aware of my business acumen, the question was whether they would ever comprehend my motivation. I turned on my car and drove away from Mercer Technologies, the building that symbolized my parents' whole lives, and the business that their daughter, the one who couldn't even read a balance sheet, now controlled in large part. Tomorrow, I would stand in front of 300 terrified workers and explain how we were going to save their jobs. I would also announce the SpaceX contract, lay out the restructuring plan, and introduce Caroline Hayes as their new CEO. All the while, my parents would be in the back of the room, watching their daughter, the one who didn't understand business, worked a small job, and needed to let the adults handle important things, explain how she'd saved everything they'd built. The company would survive, the jobs would be spared, and that had to be sufficient, even if it meant my parents might never talk to me again. It was unclear if they would appreciate me or despise me. So, tell me, what would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to choose between saving something important and potentially destroying a relationship with people you love? Let me know in the comments below. I really want to hear what you think.